Good afternoon, I'm Abe.
And I'm Frank. And today, we're adumbrating the second half of Chapter 7, The Road to Revolution, in Kennedy, Cohen, and Bailey's The American Pageant textbook. Abe, you know what to do.
Of course, it's always a pleasure. So, King George III took the throne after the acclaimed Champagne Charlie, and he was a good person, but overall a poor ruler who surrounded himself with sycophants like the Lord North. As for the Townshend Acts, they really didn't do much, so they were repealed except for the 3-pence tax on tea, which was maintained to keep Parliament's authority to tax the colonies. The colonies, in order to spread propaganda and to keep their rebellious moods, set up committees of correspondence, which were basically a network of letter writers and a forerunner of the Continental Congresses. The first committee was established by Samuel Adams, and they were key to keeping the revolution spirit rolling, as eventually every colony had established a form of a committee of correspondence, and they eventually evolved into the first American Congresses. Now, Frank, why did the British refuse to repeal the Tea Act?
Well, one of the reasons was that, by 1773, the powerful British East India Company was overburdened with 17 million pounds of unsold tea, and this was actually causing it to face bankruptcy. So the British decided to simply sell it to the Americans, right? And since there was a tax on tea, they could make millions of pounds through this sale. The Americans weren't strict, however, and they strongly resented and protested the Townshend Act's remaining tax on the tea imports. So, on December 16, 1773, some Americans, led by Patriot Samuel Adams, disguised themselves as Indians and opened 342 chests of tea and dumped it into the ocean. This event is now known as the Boston Tea Party. And a similar event occurred in Annapolis, Maryland, where they burnt the ships to water level in protest of the Townshend Act's remaining tax on tea. So, Abe, did the British Parliament continue to try to legislate the future of its colonies in America?
Yes, it did. So in 1774, by huge majorities, Parliament passed a series of intolerable acts to punish the colonies, namely Massachusetts. They were also known as the Massacre of American Liberty. So one of the first intolerable acts was the Boston Port Act, which closed the port of Boston. Another one limited self-government by forbidding town hall meetings without approval, and another revoked the charter to Massachusetts. One of the most notable intolerable acts was the Quebec Act, which was basically a good law in bad company, and it guaranteed Catholicism to French Canadians and permitted them to retain their old customs, and it also extended boundaries of Quebec all the way to the Ohio River. Americans saw this as a threat to their territory, and this act also aroused the anti-Catholics who were shocked at the enlargement that would make a Catholic area as large as the original 13 colonies. Plus, Americans were banned from this region through the Proclamation of 1763, so they felt cheated that the Canadians were given access to it. Now, Frank, how did the colonists respond to this increased repression from Parliament?
Well, they responded as we'd be proud of, by having a democratic movement to counter it. This is known as the First Continental Congress. In Philadelphia, from September 5th to October 26th, 1774, the First Continental Congress met to discuss these problems. While not wanting independence quite yet, it did come up with a list of grievances, which were promptly ignored by Parliament. 12 of the 13 colonies were present at the Continental Congress, with the exception of Georgia. They agreed to meet again in 1775. The next year, nothing happened. However, they did succeed in creating what's known as the Association, which called for a complete boycott of British goods. Fast forward 1 year, 1775. The British commander in Boston sends a detachment of redcoats to nearby Lexington and Concord to seize supplies, gunpowder, and capture Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Minutemen, having had 8 of their own killed at Lexington, fight back in Concord, pushing the redcoats back and shooting from behind rocks and trees, or Indian style. The Revolutionary War had begun. So, Abe, as the Revolution dawned, what advantages and weaknesses were prevalent within the British Empire?
Okay, so with war broken open, Britain did have a a heavy advantage. One, they had 7.5 million people to America's 2 million. Two, they had superior naval power. And three, they had great wealth. They used this great wealth to hire some 30,000 Hessians, which were basically German mercenaries. And they also hired a professional army of about 50,000 men, plus about 50,000 American loyalists and many Native Americans. So they had a very large army. However, there were also several disadvantages for the British. The British still had to deal with Ireland, which would require troops to monitor, and France was just waiting for an opportunity to stab Britain in the back. Many British also had no desire to kill their American cousins, and William Pitt even withdrew his son from the army because of this. The English Whigs at first supported the Americans, as opposed to Lord North's Tory Whigs, and they felt that if George III won, then he might become tyrannical and impose his tyrannical rule on England. Also, British generals were second-rate, and their men were brutally treated. One man was lashed 800 times for striking an officer. Provisions were often scarce, and Britain was fighting a war some 3,000 miles away from home, making it very hard to supply the colonies. America was also expansive, and there was no single capital to capture and therefore cripple the country. Now, Frank, could you tell me about the advantages and disadvantages that the Americans had?
Yeah, so similar to England, it was a double-headed coin. On the one side, advantages, the Americans had great leaders like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. They also had French aid, as France provided the Americans with guns, cannons, supplies, and gunpowder. Additionally, Marquis de Lafayette, at age 19, was made a major general in the colonial army and was a great asset. He was also from France. Additionally, the colonials were better at fighting in a defensive manner, and they were also self-sustaining off the natural environment. They didn't need the provisions that the British troops did. The Americans enjoyed the moral advantage in fighting for a just cause, and the historical odds weren't unfavorable either, since historically, when troops have a moral advantage, when they think that they're doing the right thing, they'll fight harder, they'll fight faster, and they'll fight better. The colonials were also better marksmen than their British counterparts, meaning they had greater accuracy with what weapons and with what ammunition they did have. However, let's not overstate the case here. We need to remember that, on the disadvantages side, the Americans were lacking in unity, and there was a lot of sectional jealousy between the different colonies and the appointment of military leaders. Some New Englanders even preferred British officers to Americans from other colonies. And, being realistic here, the Americans had little to no money to finance their war, and when they did try to print more money, this only resulted in inflation and the devaluation of their currency. And last but not least, America had none, in the regards of their naval capacity in fighting a war. In fact, in addition to not having a navy, the colonials were short of supplies in almost every regard. They were in desperate need of clothing, wool, and wagons to ship their food, which was most affecting them at the Valley Forge camp, where they were without basic provisions, such as bread, for over 3 days. Many soldiers had only received rudimentary training, but German Baron von Steuben, who spoke no English, showed that a good general, a good leader, could lead the colonials to victory. African Americans also fought and died in the service, though in the beginning, many colonies barred them from service. By war's end, more than 5,000 African Americans were fighting for colonial independence. But Abe, tell me, were African Americans also fighting on the British side?
Yes, so African Americans also served on the British side. In November 1775, Lord Dunmore, the Royal Governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation declaring freedom for any enslaved black in Virginia who joined the British Army. By the war's end, the British kept their word, and at least 1,400 blacks were evacuated to Nova Scotia, Jamaica, and England. Not all of the American colonists were as fiery as some of the others in their revolutionary spirit. Some colonists sold provisions to the British because the British paid in gold, and this severely undermined American morale. Many people overall just didn't even care about the revolution, and therefore raising a large number of troops was difficult, if not impossible. Only because a select few threw themselves into the cause with passion did the Americans eventually win and defeat the powerful British.
Thank you for watching. Please tune in next time where we explore the Revolutionary War in all its detail.
Finally. Catch you guys next time.